2 or 3 more things I want you to have some good background on. I want to finish up telling you about Herod and his legacy and what he left behind. There's a reason for that. It will help you to better understand some of the things that went on during the gospel period, as well as the period of the activity of the church, the book of Acts, and what happened afterwards. If you have a little bit of political background and a little bit of cultural background, it'll make some more sense out of some things. I want to interweave all through this church history some of the political and cultural background. I want to give you a little bit more background on Herod. Then I want to talk about the political and religious groups that were extant in the time of Jesus and the early church. The Herodians, the Zealots, the Hellenized Jews, the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes. We're not going to talk about any of those for any great length of time, but I do want you to know a little bit about some of those. It'll make a little bit more sense out of the events in the book of Acts, as well as when we get into some more deeper church history, start talking about the fall of Jerusalem and some of these other things. I think it will dovetail, it'll tie it all together for you so that it'll make a little more sense. The history will come alive, I hope, if we get some of this background. And then I do want to just very briefly talk to you about the Sanhedrin and the synagogue. We talked last about what happened with Herod's marriage to Mariamne. Mariamne was a Hasmonean princess. It was Herod's claim to legitimacy to marry a Hasmonean. To marry a Hasmonean princess when he wasn't truly Jewish himself. He was just a half proselyte, if you will. Gave him a little bit of legitimacy from a political standpoint to be able to say he could claim the throne of Israel. From a standpoint of his title, Rome recognized him. You know, if Rome didn't recognize you at that point, it didn't really matter. You had to have the Roman emperor's recognition or you really weren't going to be the king of anything. You'll find that that happened with Herod's children. His intention for one of his sons was to pass on the kingship, and Augustus didn't recognize his son as a king, so Augustus arranged it a little bit differently. We'll talk about that in just a minute. The last thing that we talked about was how Herod had executed his wife, his favorite wife. He executed her younger brother before he executed her, and that's really what started the snowball that ended up in her death. Aristobulus III, her teenage brother. What I want to mention here before we leave Herod is what happened with his heirs. Since the New Testament often talks about Herod this and Herod that, you need to realize there's more than one Herod and which one it is they're talking about. One of the things Herod the Great was most famous for was his building. He was a very busy builder. He was always building something. Incredible building skill and design skill. Some of the most beautiful places that still are in existence in the Holy Land today were built by Herod. The fortress at Masada was essentially built by Herod. And there's many other things. Cities, entire cities were redone and built by Herod to a pretty glorious extent. But the thing Herod is famous for building for is the temple that is usually, I doubt they named it for him in his day. They'd probably be insulted that we name it for him. But what we call the Temple of Herod. The reason we call temples that, whoever built the temple, usually we call it by their name. We call the first temple Solomon's temple, don't we? It wasn't Solomon's, but Solomon's the one who oversaw the building. The second temple that was built by Joshua and Zerubbabel. We don't usually call it Joshua's or Zerubbabel's temple, but we call it the second temple. That was the temple that was in existence when Herod took over control as king. It had been in existence at that time for a little more than 500 years. Herod was somebody that loved beauty. He loved things to be top-notch. And he was very impressed with the Roman and Greek architecture. So he felt like the temple had begun to deteriorate, and he thought it should be dressed up. Now, the biggest reason Herod did this had nothing to do with his respect for God, his desire to decorate God's temple, or his desire to make it more appealing. The reason Herod wanted to rebuild the temple, the primary reason, was political. There was always an undercurrent of Jews. In fact, there was a pretty strong undercurrent of Jews that didn't approve of Herod. They didn't approve of him being king. They didn't think he should be. And one of his political moves that was pretty savvy, actually, was to rebuild their temple in a very majestic way. Very extravagant rebuilding. Hoping that they would show him more favor. Any political unrest would quell. You know, they're happy. Look at what I did. It shows I'm a good Jew. Herod wasn't a Jew. Herod was an Idumean. He wasn't a Jew except by having had his family forced into the Jewish religion by the Maccabees at sword point, which is very unusual for the Jews. That happened later in the church, but the Jews didn't all that often forcibly convert people. But the Maccabees did. They forcibly converted Idumea, and thus Herod's family were Jews by being proselytized at the sword point. Somewhere around 19 to 20 BC is when Herod began dismantling the temple. Most people think that Herod just added to the temple and dressed it up. What he actually did was took it apart and rebuilt it. When he was done, it wasn't really even the same temple that Joshua and Zerubbabel had built. He pretty much rebuilt it entirely. He started that around 19 to 20 BC. During that time, the sacrifices and offerings never ceased. They continued. That would have been fairly difficult, I imagine. There's a lot of legends about that whole time. One of the Jewish legends, which I don't know if you can put much validity to it, but they said that it never rained during the day. All those years they were building the temple, so they were able to build all day. It didn't rain till nighttime. Well, I don't know if God's favor was on Herod rebuilding that temple or not, and that's just one of their legends. But it was built on a large hill, which is where the Temple Mount is today, that you see the Dome of the Rock. It's built on the same location that was built on. If you saw how this is structured, you might realize that the platform, which is what it is, the Dome of the Rock's built on, couldn't be the exact same area as where the temple originally would have been, the Temple of Solomon. If you were to look at a cutaway of the topography of Jerusalem, especially where the Temple Mount is, actually goes about like this. It goes downhill. What Herod did in order to expand this out, since the original temple had probably been built up here, and he wanted to build this big platform, as you can see from your handout, the original temple wasn't even as big in terms of size as this. This is the temple proper. This is what Herod wanted to build, which is not only a temple, but an enormous agora, or an agora, a big open space. This was the Roman style. In Roman cities, they'd often build whether it's a public building or a religious building, a temple or a civil building of some kind, they would surround it with all these colonnaded walls. People would stand under them and discuss doctrine and everything else around the big, massive courtyard that surrounded the temple. Anybody could come up into this courtyard part of the temple, whether you were Jew or Gentile. Once you got up to the actual building of the temple, which looks more like a fortress the way Herod built it, you see there's the court of the women. There were actually stone posts, and some of the archaeologists found one of these stone posts that were originally there at the temple. And carved into that in several languages were essentially this statement: if you were not a Jew, cross this line at your peril, because you won't get out alive. They considered the sanctity of the temple very holy, and they had these posts all around that area to let you know, if you're a Gentile, don't cross into this area. But this massive rectangular courtyard built around the temple was never there under Solomon or Joshua and Zerubbabel. This is all added by Herod. You can't see it in this picture, but the hill the temple is built on, the Temple Mount, is like this. And he wanted to build this massive platform. So he actually brought in builders that built these enormous walls and filled it in. Instead of filling it in with rubble, because eventually rubble will start to sag down. Instead of doing that, he built these enormous colonnaded galleries underneath this and built this enormous platform. So the hill goes this way and the platform comes out and down. If you look over here where it says Robinson's Arch in this corner, there's still a little bit of this left. Almost everything has been completely destroyed of the original stone that was there in Herod's time. And this wall that you can't see, that's on the other side of the picture, so to speak, is the Wailing Wall. It's the Western Wall. That's all that's left. That's not a wall of the temple. We have this mindset, I think, if you're not real familiar with Israel, that that's one of the temple walls. That has nothing to do with the original temple. It's just one of the walls of Herod's enlarged courtyard that surrounded the temple, is what the Wailing Wall, or the Western Wall, is. It took 10 years to finish the basic construction. But the actual work on this still was going on all the way up to 64 or 65 AD. Which means if they finally did finish it around 64 or 65, that's kind of discouraging. Anyone want to tell me why? It's destroyed in 70 AD. That'll at least give you some background on how that temple came about. Herod's legacy of paranoia. It's a short list of some of the murders and mayhem that he caused before we leave Herod and talk about his children. Y'all remember Aristobulus III, the 17, 18-year-old brother of his wife that he had murdered. Then his great jealousy over his wife eventually caused him to put her on trial, and she was killed in 29 BC. Right after she was killed, her mother, Alexandra, I think figuring that the Jews would all stand behind her, declared herself queen. She figured the last of the Hasmonean dynasty was dead. Her 2 children were dead. Aristobulus III was dead, and Mariamne was dead, so she says, well, I'm going to declare myself queen. That probably wasn't the smartest thing to do when you got this maniac on the throne that kills everybody for any reason to begin with. She was very quickly executed after declaring herself queen. The fact that she declared that Herod was mentally unfit to sit on the throne didn't help matters any. Herod executed Costobar, who was the husband of his sister Salome, on a charge of conspiracy a year later in 28 BC. He suspected both of his sons from his marriage to Mariamne, Alexander and Aristobulus, of conspiring to kill him. And he took them to Aquileia to be tried, and Caesar Augustus ended up talking him into getting back on good terms with them. And they were for a little while until he found some good evidence that he could take to Augustus to claim that they were conspiring to kill him. The second time he did it, he asked permission to prosecute them, and this was later in 7 BC. They were tried, found guilty, and executed. And he named his son Herod Antipater, his official heir. It wasn't long before Herod's paranoia set in again, and around 5 BC, he charged Antipater with intended murder and conspiracy against him, another one of his sons, and he removed him as heir, and he replaced him with Antipas. That was in 5 BC. In 4 BC, Herod executed his son Antipater, and he again changed the line of inheritance. And this final time, this was right before Herod died, this was what his will, if you will, declared that he wanted for his kingdom. That Archelaus would rule as the king over the kingdom, that Antipas and Philip would rule as tetrarchs over Galilee and Perea, and over Gaulonitis, which is where Golden Heights are now, Trachonitis, Botania, and Peneus. After Herod's death, Augustus did not confirm his will, and Augustus arranged things the way he wanted them to be. He did not allow anyone to receive the title of king. Most scholars believe that Herod died at his palace at Jericho at the end of March or early April in 4 BC. There's a reason that's important. Well, why do I care when that knucklehead died? I didn't like him to begin with. Well, let me tell you why it'd be important to biblical study. Herod had to be alive when Jesus was born. You can start to calculate in a very general way how far off the calendar must be if Herod died in 4 BC, and that is strongly agreed on as the date of Herod's death. Jesus certainly wasn't born at the beginning of what we consider AD, was he? Had to be off by about 4 or 5 years. He could have been born not long before Herod died. It depends on your span of time of how long you think it was before the wise men showed up. I've got reasons for both views, so I'm not going to take a side. But did the wise men show up soon after the shepherds when Jesus was still a baby? It does say he was in a house when they showed up. Did they show up a couple of years later, and that's why Herod killed all the children 2 years old and younger? If they showed up a couple years later, you've got to add 2 more years to Herod's death, which means you'd have to push back all the way to 6 BC, at least, for Jesus' birth. So there's a couple things to take into consequence. Why I wanted you to know some of this background. Part of what they've tried to look for to base the time period of Jesus' birth wasn't just when Herod died. They looked for when there were eclipses because they thought that could have had something to do with the star. And there were several major eclipses during that period of time, ranging from 1 BC. There were 2 total eclipses in 5 BC. So some people think that very well could have been the time around 5 BC when Jesus was born. Josephus described Herod's final illness, and it's interesting how similar this is to the final illness of his grandson. Anybody know who his grandson was? His illness is described in the Bible. Who can tell me who Herod's grandson was and what chapter of the Bible his gruesome illness took place? Herod. Well, you got part of it, Rodney. His name was Herod for sure. Somebody say Agrippa? Herod Agrippa the First. He died around 44 AD. Anybody know where it's at in the Bible? Oh, I put it on the handout? What in the world? Why did I do that? Well, you all are just looking at me. Now look, if you can't get the answer when it's on the page in front of you. No, I know it's just shyness that causes you not to speak up. I don't know what I put in those handouts. I'm not looking at the handout, unfortunately. beginning of the 12th chapter of the book of Acts, he executed James, didn't he? The brother of John, who was a very principal man in the church at that time. And he executed him, and you see James, the brother of Jesus. This is confusing to people. Just 3 chapters later, taking a pretty principal role. There's another James. But James, the brother of John, was one of the most principal men at that time, and he was executed by Herod in the beginning of the chapter. Herod, later in the chapter, this is Herod Agrippa the first, got so full of himself because of some big speech he made. His little head puffed up because he made a big speech. And all the people said that it's the voice of a God speaking. They thought he was a God speaking. This is the kind of compliment they gave him. And he got so puffed up about it that God struck him, an angel struck him, if you read the passage. And he came down with an illness that is very similar to what his grandfather died of. I'll change some of the words Josephus used to describe Herod's illness, but I'll read you partially what Josephus said. I'm talking about the first Herod, Herod the Great. This is a quote from Josephus. "The disease seized his entire body and greatly plagued all its parts with various symptoms." This is what caused Herod the Great to die. "For he had a fever and an intolerable itch all over the surface of his body, continual pains in his colon, tumors on his feet, an inflammation of the abdomen, and a putrefaction in his lower body that produced worms." That's how Herod the Great died, as Josephus described it. I did change a couple words for your own sake. Sounds like his grandson died in a pretty similar way to Grandpa, didn't he? If you read the 12th chapter of Acts. Josephus also stated that Herod was so concerned, because he knew he wasn't popular, no matter how much he had done, and all the great building projects that he built some incredibly beautiful things. But even all the great building projects and everything he had done to try to curry favor, Herod knew the people didn't like him. So he sent out an invitation to all the principal men. This is around 4 BC when he died. Invited them to come up, apparently to Jericho, which is where he died. If they would have known what they were coming up for, they probably wouldn't have attended the invitation. His reasoning was he figured nobody loved him much, and there certainly wasn't going to be any crying and weeping when he died. But if all the principal men showed up, and he told his sister and his heir, Salome and Archelaus essentially, if he told Archelaus and Salome, "When I die, execute all the principal men." Now, I don't know why it would have mattered to him, because he's dead. He's not going to hear all the mourning to begin with, but he thought, then everyone will be in mourning, and it won't take away from the fact that they're not at all sad that I'm dead. So all these people will be crying and weeping and moaning because all these great men died, and it'll be like them crying and weeping and moaning for me. Obviously, Herod had some issues, didn't he? But his son Archelaus and his sister Salome did not carry out his order after he died. Luckily for the principal men. We're going to talk about Herod's sons for just a few minutes, and we'll move on. Herod's son Archelaus is the one that inherited the largest bulk of what Herod's kingdom was. When you read the story of Jesus' childhood and he comes back from Egypt, Herod the Great died, didn't he? And now they say, who's ruling in his stead? The Bible says Archelaus. He was the ethnarch. Remember, a tetrarch is a ruler of 1/4. And an ethnarch is a little bit higher version of a tetrarch. When the Romans didn't really want to make you a king, they wouldn't give you that much honor, they would give you the title of an ethnarch, which means you're next best thing to a king. He was the ethnarch of Samaria, Judea, and Idumea from 4 BC to about 6 AD. So about 10 years he ruled over that land. He was such a cruel and incapable ruler that he was judged incompetent by Caesar Augustus, who dismissed him from his position and exiled him to Gaul. That's why he was only there 10 years. He was so cruel and so incompetent. So he must have been a lot like Dad. He just wasn't as good of a politician as Dad. Dad could get away with all that cruelty because he got along so well with these powerful people. He had supported them. Augustus then made Herod's other son, Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee from 6 to about 39 AD. Rather than to divide that up among the sons like Herod had originally intended, after Augustus dismissed Archelaus, he combined Samaria, Judea, and Idumea into a new province that he named Judea. So the original Judea, Idumea, and Samaria, he combined into what, when you look in your Bible in the back and you see a map of the Holy Land in the time of Jesus, you see this big bulk that says Judea. That wasn't the original Judea. That was what Augustus created. It was a larger territory. And he sent lower level governors in to govern over that, rather than to just appoint any of these sons of Herod kings. Now here's why we end up with someone like Pilate a little bit later. I want to make the connection at least for you. It was not considered a prestigious position to be a governor of Judea. That was a backwater part of the empire. So they sent low-level, not incompetent, but maybe not the highest skilled governors to govern over Judea. And they had to answer to the Roman legate in Syria. They were called prefects. The fifth prefect that ruled over Judea was Pontius Pilate, who administered that area from 26 to 36 AD. And the Alexandrian Jew Philo described him as being inflexible, a blend of self-will and relentlessness, that briberies, insults, robberies, outrages, and wanton injuries, executions without trial constantly repeated, ceaseless and supremely grievous cruelty was what Pontius Pilate was exercising. Up to that time, the four prefects before him knew enough about the Jews to know it would insult them to bring images into Jerusalem and around the temple. On their banners, their military standards, they have an image of something, or they have even an image of the emperor. That was considered very insulting in a Jewish environment. So the prefects before him, when they brought troops into the city, they didn't bring them in with images on their standards. Pontius Pilate said he could care less what they think. He brought them in with images. Caused such a riot in Jerusalem, it almost upended him. So he finally changed his mind and straightened up. He was eventually dismissed from his position over a conflict with the Samaritans. Herod Philip II ruled as the tetrarch over Iturea and Trachonitis from 4 BC to 33 to 34 AD. He was the only one of Herod the Great's sons to rule until his death. The rest of them got removed. He died childless, and his territory was placed under the Syrian legate when he died. And then Herod Antipas ruled the longest of the three sons. He ruled from 4 BC to 39 AD. I'll bet you know a little bit about Herod Antipas. He is the Herod that John the Baptist was rebuking. Herod Antipas fell in love with his brother's wife, Herodias. She fell in love with him as well. They both left their own spouses and married one another. In Matthew 14, 3-4, it's describing why Herod laid hold on John the Baptist and imprisoned him. John the Baptist was rebuking him and preaching against him for taking his brother's wife. Josephus wrote that the real underlying reason that Herod executed John wasn't that he was so insulted by this preaching, but because he was scared to death, John was going to start a political revolution because he was so popular. In 39 AD, Antipas was accused by his nephew. Guess who his nephew was? We just talked about him a minute ago. Herod Agrippa, Antipas's nephew, accused him of conspiracy against the Roman emperor. That's a pretty serious accusation in that day. Caligula, by the way, which is not one of the emperors you want to be accused of conspiracy of. Maybe some of the very worst would be someone like Domitian or Caligula or Nero. You don't want anyone claiming you're conspiring against someone like Caligula or Nero because they won't let you live long. They won't even bother investigating. They hear you're conspiring, they'll just take your life. But because of his prominence, I suppose, Caligula didn't kill him. He exiled him to Gaul. That's a good place for the Herods to be sent to, wasn't it? And that's where he died at an unknown date. And there's two other things I want to talk to you about from a political background, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the religious elements that are going on and so on in Israel. Just to give you one more piece of background so you know which Roman emperors were operating during this time, from the 1st century BC to the 1st century AD. I'm bringing all this up to the birth of the church at Pentecost, and then we'll move forward from there as far as church history. But I want to give you the rest of this background, what was going on, what the culture was like. There were only 2 Roman emperors up to that period of time, up to the time of Pentecost, unless you want to consider Julius Caesar one. Julius Caesar assumed the role of a perpetual dictator over the empire in February of 44 BC. How many months did he last as perpetual dictator? Anybody know? From February till when? Yeah, there's a reason. Was it Shakespeare that calls it the Ides of March? Isn't it amazing how Julius Caesar was considered this great and incredible individual? He was, as a general, an incredible tactician and military man. He was an incredible politician until he made this very stupid mistake of declaring himself perpetual dictator, very unlike his heir. His heir did it very slowly until finally he was that. But he did it over a period of time instead of all at one shot. Julius just declared himself a perpetual dictator, and he was assassinated on March 15th. That's the Ides of March. He didn't last too long. Cassius and Brutus and a number of other people that were even supposed to be Caesar's friends murdered him. They were so afraid that his rule would continue. Caesar had adopted his nephew as a son. Octavian was his nephew. He adopted him as his son. After Caesar's assassination, civil war broke out, part of because Mark Antony and Cleopatra wanted to seize control. That went on until 31 BC when they were defeated, and Octavian, the nephew and adopted son of Caesar, began to essentially be the leader of Rome somewhere around 31. To show you how much slower he moved than his uncle. 31 BC, he really had power. 27 BC, he started to call himself. It's one thing if someone else calls you this. He started to name himself this title. I'll give it to you in Latin and English. Imperator Caesar Divi Filius. Emperor Caesar, the Son of God. That's what he started to call himself 4 years after he became the leader. But he at least didn't do it the first month. He waited 4 years before he started to call himself by titles like that. One of the reasons I guess he felt like he could call himself by that title is because this unusual thing began. It happened especially in the later part of the first century, what's called the emperor cult. The emperor cult is the fact that they would deify the emperors. They considered them to be, just like the pharaohs and others, descended from the gods. And when they died, they were a god. So I guess Octavian felt he was justified in saying that he was Emperor Caesar, the Son of God, because they had deified Julius as a god after he was murdered. And he essentially ruled from around 31 when he started, or if you want to use 27 when he began to use these titles. He ruled all the way till 14 AD. So quite a long time for a Roman emperor. And he slowly gained more and more power as he was ruling. He was the emperor during the time of the birth of Jesus. That's why I wanted you to have some of this background. He was the one that declared the census. He was the one who controlled the world at that time. And he was really at the peak of his power when Jesus was born. Remember, he was declaring himself the Son of God, 27 BC. If Jesus was born in 5 or 6, he had had 20 years to consolidate his power. And he still ruled another 20 years after Jesus' birth. So he was an extremely powerful individual. And that's who was ruling the civilized world during the birth and early years of Jesus. He later took the title Caesar Augustus. The emperor that followed him was Tiberius. Tiberius ruled from 14 to 37. The reason I want to give you these two is because Caesar Augustus was the emperor from the time of the birth of Jesus, to say Jesus' time even when he went up to the temple as a child and so on. Tiberius was the emperor from the time of Jesus' activity and his ministry to the birth of the church. So when the church was born at Pentecost, Tiberius was the emperor at that particular point in time. He was the son of Augustus' second wife, Livia, by a previous marriage. And he was involved in a bit of a shotgun wedding. Augustus wanted Tiberius to marry Augustus' daughter, Julia. You imagine who Julia was named for, don't you? Uncle Julius, right? He wanted to marry his daughter, Julia. Julia was an extremely immoral young lady, famous in Rome for her terrible immorality. He didn't want to marry her, so it was a bit of a shotgun wedding. He wasn't very interested in politics. The prefect of his Praetorian Guard was a man named Sejanus. Sejanus was extremely anti-Jewish, and it was Sejanus who appointed Pontius Pilate. Tiberius didn't want really to do much in terms of politics, so Sejanus was exercising a lot of the power, his commander of the Praetorian Guard, and he appointed Pontius Pilate. Wonder if he did that because he knew Pontius Pilate was going to be so unfeeling and uncaring and ruthless towards the Jews because he didn't like the Jews. But like all men that don't really have the position or are exercising power outside their position, Sejanus overreached himself and Tiberius executed him eventually in 31 AD. So there's our cultural background. I'm going to start by talking to you about the political divisions that were going on in Israel during the time of Jesus and the time of the early church. There were several major divisions, politically speaking. One of them was what we would pronounce this word zealots, but it was pronounced zealots. They were a Jewish element that was extremely anti-Roman. They would have been the ones more than anything else that would have wanted to overthrow Rome and get them out of Judea, out of Israel. You realize Jesus had two of the very extremes among his disciples. You know who they were? Simon Zelotes, Simon the Zealot, and Matthew. What did Matthew do? Oh, tax collector, all right. Well, why would that be so terrible? The biggest thing the Zealots had that made them matter than anything else, they believed that God alone is Lord, and no man should be paid taxes. So they believed Caesar was taking God's position by taxing them. If they were to pay any taxes, they'd pay it to the church. They'd pay it to the temple. A temple tax. To pay a tax to the civil ruler, Oh no. And to pay a tax to a foreign ruler? And you do realize the Caesars thought of themselves as gods, so to pay a tax to a foreign ruler that thought he was God? So how do you think those two got along? One that was a zealot Jesus had to deal with, the other one that was a former, I don't think he kept collecting taxes after Jesus called him, I hope he didn't, but one that was a former tax collector. Two of the extremes of society. They believed passionately that God would help them, the Zealots, to overthrow the yoke of Rome if they violently rebelled. They believed that if they just took up swords and violently rebelled, God would back it up. They were probably going back in their minds 100 years because it seems like that happened under the Maccabees, doesn't it? Looks like God backed that up. Or at the very least, their innate gifts, that their hereditary gifts allowed them to overwhelm their enemies, whatever it might be. But there's some biblical references in Daniel that very well might be talking about God backing up the Maccabees. So maybe the Zealots thought they were the descendants. They were going to take back the kingdom for Israel. And God will back us up if we violently oppose them. They were the most violent, extremist element in the Jewish-Roman wars that went from 66 to 73 AD when the temple was destroyed in 70. They were the ones that kept it going. When there were other Jews that would have been willing to surrender to Rome, eventually the Zealots took control. And it was a sect of the Zealots that were the last ones left at Masada in 73 when the Romans finally took Masada. And rather than to be captured, I think most of you probably know that story, they actually killed themselves rather than to be captured. There was an element inside the Zealots, I'm calling them Zealots, but it's the same thing, Zealots, called the Sicarii. It's a Latin word. Sicarii is how you pronounce it in Latin. Sicarius is the singular. Sicarii is the plural. Sicarius means dagger man. You know what their role was? They were like the extremist. They would roam through the festivals with the dagger in their cloak, looking not necessarily just for Romans, looking for any of their fellow Jews that were palling it up with the Romans. And they'd stick you if they saw you associated with the Romans. So they were called the Sicarii. They were the most dangerous and extremist element, especially in the 50s AD, of the Zealots. They were the part of the Zealots that died at Masada. There's two other parties. The Herodians, they were supporters of Herod. And then there were Hellenized Jews. They were Jews that had picked up a lot of the Greek culture and language. A lot of what you see in the second chapter of Acts on the day of Pentecost, all those different people that showed up, because it was noised abroad, the scripture says in the King James, and all those people showed up on the day of Pentecost to see what was going on, and they heard them speaking in their different dialects, didn't they? Those were all Jews. It mentions a lot of different countries. They were Jews that had come up for the Feast of Pentecost from all those countries where the diaspora had been dispersed to. And they were Hellenized Jews. They were Jews that had begun speaking some of the language of the areas they lived in, taking on their culture, and so on. So that was another element. I want to talk to you about these three principal religious elements that were going on in the time of Jesus in the early church. First of all, the Sadducees. The name Sadducees believed to have derived probably from the name Zadok, who was the priest during the time of David and Solomon. Or it could even come from a root word that means just ones. The Sadducees were principally made up of the aristocrats. The sophisticated, the elite of society, the most wealthy, the most connected. Many of the Sadducees were priests and wealthy and aristocratic friends of priests. There was a very distinct contrast between the Pharisees and Sadducees. Unlike the Pharisees, they believed the priesthood was the sole office responsible for interpreting and teaching the Torah, the law. The law is not the entire Tanakh, but the books of Moses. To really understand them, you've got to understand that they were both conservative and liberal. They were conservative when it comes to the Bible because they believed that only the Torah, only the 5 books of the law were inspired by God, and the rest of the Bible you couldn't take on the same level. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they took to be absolutely inerrantly inspired. That was the Torah. The rest of the Bible wasn't on the same level to the Sadducees. So their understanding of angels and the resurrection, they took strictly out of the Torah, out of the 5 books of Moses. If you tried to argue with them, well, what about Job? What about Daniel? They'd say it doesn't matter. The only truly inspired Word of God is the Torah. So you couldn't use any other parts of the what they call the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nathan, and the Ketub. You couldn't use any other part of the Bible to argue with them. They only would go to the Torah. So they were extremely conservative in that sense. They were very liberal politically, though. If you think about this for a minute, it'll make perfect sense to you. Somebody that's wealthy and aristocratic, and this is what's so amazing about the founding of this nation. It's the exact opposite. But somebody that's wealthy and aristocratic and connected and has all the benefits of society, do you think they're going to want to lose any of that? No. And when you got a powerful empire like Rome that comes in and you know you can't get rid of them, the best thing to do is be friends. Keep the peace. Try to make friends with the Romans. Here's another very strong differentiation between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. They did not believe in scribal traditions. The Pharisees believed in the scribal traditions. If you want to see the extension of that today, you know the Pharisees are still alive and well. Do you realize that modern rabbinical Judaism is essentially Phariseeism? I don't mean that in an insulting way. I mean, it's the heirs. They are essentially the heirs of the Pharisees, not the Sadducees. And you can see how they progressed even in that way now. Do you realize that after the time of Christ, they begin to compile all the oral traditions and other things in what they call there's parts of this, the Mishnah, the Gemara, and so on, into what they call the Talmud, which is a massive collection of oral and written traditions that are like commentary on different things in the Bible. That would have meant nothing to the Sadducees. It would have no value whatsoever. But the Pharisees took traditions like that and put them on the same level as the written Word of God. They said if a man of God is anointed, what he says, even if it's not in the Bible, is equal to the Bible. So that's one of the differences between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And they did not consider the writings of the prophets of equal authority or of divine inspiration. This is the Sadducees, as the Torah. And they did not believe, I want to stress it again, that you could use the writings of the prophets to prove or define doctrine. They rejected the belief in angels, and they rejected the belief in the resurrection of the dead. This might give you a little background in this interesting way that Jesus approached them when he made this statement, when they were discussing the resurrection with Jesus. You know what his argument to the Sadducees when they were trying to pin him in the corner about the resurrection? His argument to them was, isn't God the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob? And isn't he the God of the living and not the dead? Didn't he say, I am the God, present tense, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? That was Jesus' point, you know. God didn't say, I was the God of Abraham. He said, I am the God, present tense, as if Abraham was still alive to God. So thus Jesus' point was, if there's no resurrection, how can God say he is the God of Abraham? He'd have to say he was. That's really what Jesus was saying in that argument. You know where that comes from? Anyone want to take a guess? Anyone want to take a guess what part of the Bible it comes from? Sadducees didn't believe that you could argue doctrine or you could prove anything except if it was in the Torah. It's in Exodus 3:6. It's when Moses was at the burning bush. So Jesus used the scripture from Exodus. It would have been a whole lot easier to use Job's words. You want to talk about the resurrection? Job said he's going to stand at that latter day on the earth. You could use 12th chapter of Daniel when it says that he'll come up in his lot at the end of days and some of those other things. No, see, the Sadducees wouldn't have accepted that. Jesus knew full well that he could have used a lot of scriptures throughout the prophets and the writings that would have proved the resurrection. He went to the Torah, he went to Exodus, because he knew that that's the only thing they would have accepted. Their activity and operation was centered around the temple. This is pretty much what did away with the Sadducees. After the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, what do you think happened to Israel when the Romans destroyed the temple? There was no more temple for the Sadducees to be a priesthood over. And we don't even know when they disappeared, but they just slowly disappeared out of history. That left only the Pharisees, because the Essenes died out as well, left only the Pharisees to continue on, and that is what the modern Jews, from a religious standpoint, are today, the descendants of the Pharisees. A little bit about the Pharisees. That word Pharisees believed to be derived from the Hebrew word parush, P-A-R-U-S-H, which can mean separate or interpret. They didn't use that term for themselves, though. That wasn't their normal term for themselves. They would sometimes call themselves scribes or sages, and you can see how this was inherited later. They would call themselves rabbi. Possibly the Pharisees originated sometime during the Maccabean revolt. Josephus states that there were 6,000 Pharisees in the first century, and that they were the most influential group among the common people. That would make sense, wouldn't it? Because the Sadducees were all aristocrats, wealthy individuals. The Pharisees were common men. It also would make sense if you understand the Pharisees believed you did not have to be a priest or in a particular position to teach and to preach. They were determined to maintain the purity of their Jewish religious culture and traditions in opposition to Hellenization, that's becoming more Greek, and Romanization, becoming more like the Romans. Where the Sadducees were willing to take on some of Rome's traditions and things because we want to keep the peace, right? We don't want to lose our position. We don't want to lose our priesthood. The Pharisees didn't want to take on any of that. They were very, very tightly disciplined observers of the Mosaic Law and the scribal traditions, and the two pillars of their faith were the Torah and tradition. They believed in the law and in the traditions that they had passed down in their teachings. And they did believe, unlike the Sadducees, that the writings and the prophets were equal to the Torah, equal to the 5 books of Moses in terms of doctrine and authority. Most of the Pharisees were not priests. Unlike the Sadducees, they believed that if someone was divinely anointed or inspired in their teaching or interpretation of the Torah, that was equal or even greater sometimes in importance in the Torah itself. So they believed in what I suppose you refer to as progressive revelation, revealing more as time goes on. Now, I'm sure that made the Sadducees really irritated because they felt like they were adding to the Scripture. After the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, as I told you, they became the principal class. And the rabbinical form of Judaism practiced from the first century to today is primarily Pharisaic. And then finally, the Essenes. They're not mentioned in the Bible. Most people believe that Qumran, the area where the Dead Sea Scrolls was discovered, was an Essene community, and that the Dead Sea Scrolls were Essene writings. They were very strict separatists. They believed that you had to separate yourself from everyone else in society and that you had to live in a cloistered setting like you would see the monks did later in the Catholic system, monasticism. They separated themselves from society. They did not want to be too close to anybody. They felt like you'd be ritually unclean if you got too close. They wanted to stay in their own societies and stay very separate and holy. You had to swear an oath when you got initiated, and very strict discipline was imposed on you. Celibacy was probably practiced by most of the members. And they were extremely frugal. People have tried to make parallels between the Essenes and early Christians. They held sacred meals to which only initiates were invited. So someone could say, well, that's similar to communion. They had frequent ritual purification baths. In fact, in the community at Qumran, they had these areas where you would go down steps into a pool, and it wasn't to literally clean your body. It was symbolic. You went down under the water. They were very strict regarding following of the Sabbath and ritual cleanliness. They rejected the temple order at Jerusalem, including the priesthood. They had no respect whatsoever for the priesthood or any of the sacrifices they were offering at the temple. In fact, a lot of them believed that a man is his own priest, and they all thought they should offer their own sacrifices right there at Qumran. They managed to exist for a long time in this pretty difficult political environment, mainly because of King Herod. One of their leaders, called Menahem, prophesied that King Herod was going to be a great and mighty king and was going to inherit this country, which he did. Herod was so impressed that one of these Essene prophets prophesied about him that he let them get away with a lot of things other people couldn't get away with. And then here's a couple differences between some of their views. Fate and free will, that we've been talking about in some of our doctrine of God. Whether or not everything is predetermined and fatalistic, or whether or not you have free will. The Essenes believed in predestination. Everything is fated to happen. There's nothing you can do to change it. Sadducees believed in a complete and entire human free will. And the Pharisees believed in a combination of fate and free will. They believed God predestinates some things, and then He allows human free will as well. And then finally, one other example, the soul and the resurrection. The Essenes believed that the flesh would rise again and one day be immortal. The Sadducees believed the soul is not immortal and there is no resurrection. And the Pharisees, there was a little bit of differentiation between them. Some of the Pharisees believed that the soul was mortal, that it died, but there's still a resurrection. And some believed the soul was immortal, like the Greeks taught, and that there was a resurrection.
Predestination will on an individual basis or like...
In terms of the Sadducees and Pharisees, the Sadducees did not believe there was any predestination individually. I'm sure they believed that God predestined world events. Yeah. That is the way you remember the Sadducees. So you don't believe in the resurrection, you'd be sad, you see. Yeah, the Essenes, Bruce, believed that everything was predestinated to the tiniest, and I don't, that's not my theology, but they believed everything down to the tiniest degree was predestinated. It's all fate. The Pharisees believed, probably closer to the way I believe, that they would probably, I think you could probably say they would believe that God predestinates events and kingdoms and groups, similar to how I believe it. The Sanhedrin, we'll talk about the synagogue next time and then get right into the actual history of the church whenever we have another history class. But the Sanhedrin was made up of 71 men, the high priest and 70 of the elders of Israel. It was a mixed group, the Sanhedrin. The leader was always Sadducee, but it was a mix of Sadducees and Pharisees, which is why Paul could start the ruckus he did. Remember when they called him before the Sanhedrin? There's all kinds of views on why Paul said what he said when the high priest struck him and he basically called him a whited wall and rebuked the high priest. And they said, how can you rebuke the high priest? Don't you realize that's the high priest? Oh, I didn't realize that was the high priest. Well, was that sarcastic or did he not realize? If you look at your picture, the high priest sat right in the middle of this big ark. And here were 35 men on each side of him. And there's the accused standing in the middle. They base that on going all the way back to Moses and the 70 elders of Israel. I don't know if that's legitimate, but that's what they say. And they say that after Ezra and Nehemiah restored the operation of the city of Jerusalem, that Ezra set up 70 elders, and that's what became the Sanhedrin. So the Sanhedrin was basically their court. Up to a point, that court could pass the death penalty for anything that broke the law of Moses. If somebody committed adultery, they could pass the death penalty and take them out and have them stoned. Around the time of the birth of Jesus, that power was taken away from them by the Roman government. They didn't allow them to pass the death penalty anymore. The rabbis wrote this. It's a matter of record. The rabbis at that time wrote that they were in a terrible state because the promise of Genesis 49 was the scepter would not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh came. And to him will the gathering of the people be, Shiloh the Messiah. They said the Messiah has not come and we just lost the ability to have the scepter of authority. And that was right at the time Jesus was born. Maybe they should have been looking like Simeon and Anna for Shiloh. But instead they thought, God help us, we've lost our power. God's promises are going to fail. God's promises cannot fail. If they had realized that God's promises are yea and amen, if they'd realized that my word shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing whereunto I sent it. If they had believed that, if they really believed it, they would have been looking everywhere for their Messiah because he hadn't have been born. Because they were right. They lost the power. They lost the scepter. They lost the ability to exercise the most important part of their law, and that's to punish sin with the death penalty. They should have been looking for Shiloh. They were given other clues. I'll give you one other scripture, the book of Ezekiel. I'll let you find it. I won't tell you where it's at. It says, I shall overturn it until he comes to whom it belongs. That's literally what Shiloh's name means, he to whom it belongs. He's going to overturn Israel. He did. He overturned them from Babylon to Medo-Persia. That's the first overturning. He overturned them from Medo-Persia to Greece. I shall overturn it. Third overturning. That's Greece to Rome. And he shall come whose right it is. What do you think of that? To whom it belongs. They should have been looking. They lost the scepter. There was Shiloh, and then the other scripture is directly referring to Shiloh in Ezekiel. Told them that they're going to be overturned 3 times. They were. The last overturning, they were turned into the hands of Rome. As soon as Rome gained power over them and they lost the scepter, they should have been looking everywhere for their Messiah. Anybody know what the word synagogue means or what language it comes from? It comes from the Greek word synagoge. It means a gathering together, an assembly. Very close to the meaning of the Hebrew word neset. The word neset in Hebrew means assembly, or gathering together. Originally, the idea of a synagogue was very similar to that of a church in the sense that it didn't represent a building as much as a gathering together of people. The church still represents a gathering together of people, not a physical locality. There is a pretty distinct difference between the temple and the synagogue in the first century. Now, I'm not talking about a modern Jewish synagogue. There's some things that have changed. But from the first century idea of a synagogue, even from medieval Judaism forward, a synagogue in today's terminology is a lot closer to a church in what we do in a church. Where in the first century it was a little bit different than that. You have to remember that before the fall of Jerusalem, the temple was still in existence. So anything that was considered worship or sacrificial or ritual type operation went on at the temple, not the synagogues. The synagogues were a place of teaching and study and discussion of the scripture. There was a ritual attached to the temple that wasn't the same with the first century synagogue. The temple was the place for the sacrifices, the offerings. It was the place where you came to really be in the presence of God, where atonement was offered up. None of those things begin to carry over into the synagogue till after the destruction of the temple. Most of first century Judaism was not quite the same as what you'd see in a modern day synagogue. It was far closer to what you would think of as what we're doing right now in here. This would be very similar to the way a synagogue worked in the first century. It is interesting to see some of the parallels since we've been talking about church history. It might give you an idea of how the church even developed some of their rituals. The way the churches were built, how they were set up, how the structure and the government. The temple was considered in first century Judaism where God resided. And the synagogue was the place where the people gathered together. So it was a little bit of a contrast. God's house versus an assembly house for the people. Judaism in the first century had how many temples? Now, if the pastors are going to answer this, then we're in trouble. I know they know. But how about you saints? How many temples? Just one temple. Many, many synagogues. Some cities had many synagogues in one city. One difference between the synagogue and the temple was that the temple was not a publicly accessible building. Not everybody could just go in and out of the temple. Depending on your gender, there were certain places in the temple you could go and certain places you couldn't. In the temple, there was a court of the women. The ladies could only go so far, and that doesn't mean they were considered a lower quality. It just means there was a role that the men had to play in the operation of the temple that only the men could play that role. And then, just because you were a man didn't mean you got to play that role in its entirety either. There were some men that could only go so far as well. Any man that was of one of the tribes of Israel couldn't just decide to go into the holy place. Wasn't true in the order of the tabernacle, wasn't true in the order of the temple. Just because you were a man and a child of the seed of Abraham did not give you the right to enter into the temple proper. You could go into the courtyard, but you could not enter into the temple. In fact, part of what a man's responsibility was in some sacrificial offerings was for the man to go into the courtyard. The head of the household had to often offer up the sacrifice himself. The priest was there with him, and the priest would lay it on the altar and arrange it and so on and finish the sacrifice. But sometimes it was the man that had to actually cut the throat of that animal, standing in then for his family in some of those sacrifices. But he didn't walk in there with his wife. He went in there alone to stand in for his family. And if a man, say, of the tribe of Benjamin couldn't say, well, I think I'd like to go into the holy place and look around. I've never seen it inside there. You didn't get to go into the holy place. It required another distinction. Not only did you have to be a head of a household, but you'd have to be of the line of Aaron for you to be able to go into that particular operation. Just because you were of the tribe of Levi didn't mean that you got to open up the veil between the holy and the holiest. That was only to be done by the high priest. So the temple wasn't a publicly accessible place, but the synagogue was. Anybody could come to the synagogue. Gentiles could even come into the synagogues. That wasn't going to happen on the Temple Mount, though. You didn't enter into even the courtyard in any true sense of the temple if you were a Gentile. The outer area around the temple was what they would refer to as the court of the Gentiles. So the temple wasn't publicly accessible, but the synagogue was. And the synagogue and the temple had two very distinctly different purposes. The purpose of the temple was to come with supplications, with need for atonement, with need for sins to be forgiven, to worship and offer up thanksgiving to God. That really wasn't the purpose of the synagogue. It wasn't like what we think of as a church today. A church today covers almost all those bases. You do all those things, don't you? When you come to church, you want to worship, offer up thanksgiving to God. You're doing some of the things in a modern church that they would have considered temple worship. Whereas we also do some things in a modern church that would not have been part of the temple operation, but would have been synagogue worship. If you went, well, that might be the wrong word, but synagogue order. So we have a little bit different. We have a blending maybe of both the temple and the synagogue type of approach in the modern church, at least in our church. I can't speak for everyone's, but in ours. The synagogue was principally for the reading and teaching of the law. And I guess if you wanted to make a modern application to that, it'd be like comparing a church to a seminary. There's a big difference between a church and a Christian college, a college maybe that's for the purpose of training people in theology. You don't generally think when you go to a Christian college that you're going into the classroom to worship and to pray. I hope they do pray. But you do that when you go into a church. That's similar to probably the distinction between the two. The origins of the synagogue, there's multiple theories about when the synagogues originated. One pretty good theory, possibly, is that they originated during the time of the Babylonian captivity, which began around 606, 607, but really reached its peak around 586 BC when Nebuchadnezzar sacked Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, destroyed the city, and took captive probably the largest number to Babylon. During that 20-year period, from around 606 to around 586, there were deportations of Jews going on, being taken to Babylon. One tradition holds that during that time, since they weren't able to worship at the temple, in order to keep their identity from a religious and a cultural standpoint, they met together in homes or in small gatherings as they were allowed to in these foreign countries they were dispersed in. That became the origin of the synagogue. So that's one belief of that. And then another belief is that the synagogues originated after the Babylonian exiles had returned to Judea, so sometime around 538 or later, during the religious reforms of Ezra. There's some little clues that maybe this could be the case. You notice that when Ezra is preaching to the people, he gathers together the ministry, if you want to call it that. He gets up on what amounts to, it's called a pulpit in the King James Version, but it's what amounts to a little platform, and preaches to the people. And he essentially says that he read the law to them, made them to understand it, to cause it to be clear and distinct. Part of which, the reason for that was that during that, what amounted to 70 years of captivity between the time that they originally began to go into captivity and started to come back, you got to think what can happen in 70 years, saints. That's 2 entire generations of people. You can have grandchildren, and even further than that. And a lot of them begin to lose their identity in terms of their language, and some of them no longer spoke Hebrew fluently. They spoke Aramaic, which was the common trade tongue. So by the time they got back, there were created what were called the Aramaic Targums. A Targum is a paraphrase. They would take the Bible that was written in Hebrew and they would paraphrase it, like we'd make a modern translation into Aramaic, and then they'd explain it and teach on it. Probably what Ezra was doing, and some people believe that was probably the foundations of what began the synagogues. Another idea was that it was originated by the Jewish diaspora in Egypt. Egypt was where the Septuagint was translated. This would have been around the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC. There were some foundation stones that archaeologists found in that area they think were dedication stones for synagogues. They thought that may be where they originated. And then finally, and this is probably the most likely in terms of actual buildings that were synagogues, was during the Hasmonean period that we talked about some weeks ago. That's the first time you hear the word synagogue start to be used in any writings. It's the first time they start to refer to it and to the leaders of the synagogue. So here's how a synagogue was set up. There wasn't any fixed size or particular architecture to the early synagogues. It really depended upon the wealth of the congregation. If you wanted to build an enormous synagogue, I think the largest synagogue right now in the world is in Jerusalem. And if I remember correctly, it can seat 6,000 people. It was built usually upon the highest ground that they could find. They wanted it to stick up above everything else in the community. I'm talking about the first century synagogues. I don't think this would be applicable to all the synagogues today. They wanted the roof of the synagogue to stick out above the roofs of all the other buildings. And a funny parallel, quite often in modern churches we have a steeple. Now there's nothing biblical about a steeple. If you decide to take the steeple off the church, you wouldn't offend God, I think, in one bit. Now, I'm not going to pull our steeple down, but you're not going to offend God by pulling the steeple off, because there's nothing biblical about a steeple. There's nothing religious about a steeple, other than that when you see it, and maybe here's a good reason that it's nice to have a steeple, when you see it, you know immediately that's a church. It's not just a warehouse. I wouldn't argue this is how steeples originated, but they were so determined in the first century synagogues to make sure it stuck up that if they couldn't get it on high enough ground, sometimes they would get a large pole and attach it to the roof. So no matter where you were, you could pick out where the synagogue was at in town because there was a big pole sticking out. So generally the construction was built so that whichever way the benches were facing, you'd be facing Jerusalem. That was the way the first century synagogues were built. Today, like I said, depending on whether it's Sephardic or Ashkenazic or Mizrahic or whatever the particular strain of Judaism is, they've got some slight differences. But now today, Today, modern synagogues are built if they're west of Jerusalem. For example, a synagogue, if this was a synagogue, everybody would have to sit facing that way. So you all on this side are in good shape. The rest of you are in trouble. Everybody would have to sit facing that way. That's east. And synagogues built east of Jerusalem, if someone was in Iraq or Iran or somewhere like that, you'd have to sit facing west so that you're pointed at Jerusalem. And always that wall, so this wall, that'd be appropriate, where that fireplace is at, is where the niche, if you want to call it that, in the ancient synagogues, was built that held the ark, that held the Torah scrolls. All the synagogues in first century Judaism had some common features. Among the seating all around the building were what Jesus referred to as the chief seats. Those are the seats for the men who had some position of authority in regards to the synagogue. Some role that they had a position of special authority, or they're part of the synagogue council, or whatever the case might be. The ruler or rulers, as the King James calls it. Ladies, I don't know how much you'd appreciate this in modern day church worship, but the ladies had to sit either in a separated room, like a balcony, or behind lattice work. It really doesn't have as much to do with worship as it has to do with what the purpose of the synagogue was. What did I tell you the purpose of the synagogue was? Teaching, interpreting the law. The men were the ones doing the teaching and so on. So I suppose their reason, if they would have said, well, why do you have the ladies sitting back there? Well, they're not involved in the authoritative activity of what was going on in the synagogue. Especially in the modern synagogues, there's a platform elevated by 2 or 3 steps, usually somewhere around the center of the synagogue. The Ashkenazi Jews call it by a name that we'd probably be a little more familiar with than the word used by the Sephardic Jews. The Ashkenazi calls it the bima, if you want to pronounce it that way. I'm trying to westernize these pronunciations a little bit. I'm not trying to roll my words or use any glottal stops or anything else to do it. I'll try to make it a way you can pronounce it yourself. That word is a Greek word, by the way. It's in the King James Version 13 times. Anybody want to take a swat at what it is translated as? The word bima really, at its root, means steps. So it's saying a place that's stepped up. But the word bima in the Greek usage in a political sense has a little bit different connotation than just steps. It means a higher place. That'll get you closer to it. When Paul went before some of the Roman governors, they were seated on the bima. Does that help? It says we're all going to have to appear before the bima of Christ. Judgment seat is the word that's most often translated in the King James Version. That's the Greek word for the place where they stood in the synagogue to read the law and to declare and interpret it. So I suppose that wherever this is being presented, if it's being presented the right way, is a bima. It's a judgment seat. Because this is what judges you, saints. One day you'll stand before the judgment seat of Christ in a literal sense. But this is the judgment seat of Christ. If he's called a minister and there's an anointed message and the word is there is a bima in a church. There's a judgment seat, and that judgment seat is centered around the candle and candlestick of that church. You know what the candle and candlestick are, don't you? When Jesus said through John to the 7 churches, made statements like this, that if you're not careful, if you don't straighten up, I'll remove your candle and candlestick out of your city, out of your church. What does that mean? Does that mean you're going to have church in the dark? Well, it does mean that, but not quite in a literal sense. Does that mean you'd have to sit in here in the dark? What's the candle and the candlestick? It's the office of the minister and the minister. The candlestick is that office. The candle in the candlestick is the minister that fills that office. And if that minister is pure, and if he is called of God, and if he's got the anointing of God on him, there'll be illumination that comes from that candle. Bema literally means step in the Greek, but it is usually translated as a judgment seat. Right around the bema in the center of the synagogue was essentially a pulpit or a desk where someone would stand and read the Word of God. So when Jesus went into the synagogues, he didn't just stand up in the audience like we would think of someone testifying. When Jesus or anyone else, Paul later in the book of Acts particularly, went in synagogues quite often and preached. When they came in to preach, they didn't preach in a way that we would think of having a testimony service. And somebody would stand up across the congregation and have something to say. You'd come up behind what amounts to the pulpit on the bema above everybody so they could see you, and you'd talk to them. On the side facing Jerusalem would have been what amounts to an alcove in the wall which held an ark that contained the Torah scrolls. The Jews had, and still do, they haven't lost that for certain, had a very distinct, and we ought to as well, saints. I try to teach my daughters this. They're learning slow but sure. And I don't just leave my Bible just laying around anywhere to begin with. I don't leave my Bible by the kitchen sink. I don't leave it anywhere where food could be prepared. I don't leave it anywhere where there could get anything splashed on it or get anything else on it. I don't do that. I have too much respect for it to want to do anything that would harm it. I very seldom put anything, papers, anything that's really going to cover it like that. I don't know. It's just, I'm not telling you need to do that. It's just my respect for God's Word. I feel like I want to put it in a certain place. Jews take it far further than that. You know, in a real Orthodox synagogue, when they're walking around the synagogue with the Torah, you're never to turn your back to it. You have to literally turn and follow it as it goes around the synagogue. part of that is carried over from that original idea that you're sitting facing it. When you stand, you're to face that as well. And then the order and operation of the synagogue. A synagogue was to be established wherever there were at least 10 Jewish men able to do so. So you can see how there could be quite a few synagogues in one city. If you had a large enough city like Jerusalem, you could have a lot of synagogues in that city, because you might have a synagogue over here on this street and maybe 30 men and their families were in that synagogue. That'd amount to a pretty good amount of people if you think about it, especially in that day. It might be 100 people if you had 30 men. But say you had 10 men and their families, maybe 40 or 50 people. You might have somebody else that was across town, and remember, you're not always going to ride your horse or donkey or whatever, camel, from place to place. A lot of places people walked. So maybe if you're far enough across town, you wanted to open a synagogue over there. If you had 10 godly men to open it, it wouldn't be a problem at all. As long as there were 10 men, 10 was usually the general number that they used for the synagogues in the first century. Some communities, of course, then had multiple synagogues, and taxes were taken, if you want to call it taxes, for its maintenance, similar to how we would do an offering. Tithes and offerings. That's how the synagogue was kept up. That's how they maintained it. The leader of the synagogues had a Greek title. This is a little strange, you think they'd have a Greek title, but you have to realize that from Alexander the Great's time on, the Jews became more and more Hellenized. They started to use the Greek language more. They principally used the Aramaic and Greek language to express thoughts. That's why they translated the Septuagint. The Septuagint was a translation, I mentioned it here earlier, in the 2nd or 3rd century BC. It's a lot of legends surrounding it, so it's hard to tell exactly when it was translated. Hard to tell exactly how it was translated. They say there were around 70 or 72 that translated it. That's why it's called the Septuagint, the 70, the translation of the 70. It was a translation of the Hebrew scriptures from Hebrew into Greek. When the Jews began to get Hellenized enough, they needed to have their Bible in Greek so that some people can understand that didn't know the Hebrew. The name of the leader of the synagogue in Greek was the Archysynagogos. It's not hard to pull that apart, though. What is an archangel? So what would an Archysynagogos be? If an archangel is the highest angel, yeah, he's the highest guy in the synagogue. He was the chief of the synagogue, the leader of the synagogue. I had a quote in here that I thought was interesting to describe. It says, the ruler of the synagogue was in charge of synagogue worship. He was the president of the organization, often being its founder. He led the meetings of the organization. In Jewish society, this official was highly respected and esteemed. He chose the persons who led in worship and assigned them their role in the worship service. He was in charge of building the synagogue and keeping it in order. At times, this meant the ruler of the synagogue had to bear the financial burden himself. Not too far different from a pastor of a church today, is it? Now, I'm not bearing the financial burden of the assembly. We've got wonderful people that give and help to bear the burden. We do it as well in our own way, but he was the founder, as well as if worst came to worst and the 10 men who he'd started out with couldn't support it, then he sometimes bore that financial burden. It is interesting how many parallels there are here with the churches. He was the one who was the leader over the church. There was a council of leaders that went along with him. Officers of the synagogue is one title they were given. It's funny how similar this is to the modern church order as well. They were elected either by the congregation of the synagogue or by a council. Meaning there would be some type of deacons, we wouldn't use that word for the Jews, but some type of deacons or some type of trustees that would elect other trustees when it was necessary to elect them, or the whole congregation would elect those people to those positions. They were the council, the officers of the synagogue. The original operation of the synagogue, unlike modern day usages, I want to stress this again because this is what was so different, looks like it was only for reading, for study and discussion of the scripture, not for prayer, not for testimonies or devotion or for worship. Those things were centered either in your home or at the temple. We've blended all that in the modern church. But it is interesting to note how many parallels there are with both of those in the modern church, whether that was intended by God or whether we've done that through our own traditions. That's what I want you to think about. The leaders of the synagogue could ask any capable man to speak. So it wasn't as if you had to be educated at a seminary of some kind. It wasn't as if you had to be part of the priesthood. They did respect the priest, but the priests, when they came into the synagogue, did not have a position of authority in the synagogue. But if a priest came in, they did give them due respect, but they didn't have any type of a particular position in the synagogue. This is one of the reasons I want to give you this background before we actually get into the history of the early church proper. That's why you can see that some of the men in the early church who were men who were respected in their own right, like Paul, who had been educated and had been a man who was part of the rabbinical class, part of the teaching part of that society. They would have loved to have him come in and speak. If somebody had been trained under Gamaliel, which Paul was, someone who was cultured in the law and trained and educated in the law, they would have welcomed you to come in and speak. Now that might not have lasted too long once they realized what Paul was coming in to speak about, but before the word got around especially, they would have loved to have Paul come in and speak. He would have been somebody they would have considered capable. Little different from the temple. Again, I want to stress this. You didn't walk in the temple and say, you know what, my dad was a good man, I'm a good man, I'm going to come in here and offer up some sacrifices for some people while I'm stopping in town. You didn't do that. The priest was the only one offering up sacrifices. In the synagogue, if you had something to say and they felt like you were capable enough to say it, they'd let you have the right to speak. You can probably see why the synagogue was a real core area for the Pharisees. Remember, they were the ones that appealed to the common people. They thought that you didn't have to be a priest to teach the law. And you could see why the temple worship would have been the central place for the Sadducees, who were the elite of the society, who believed you had to be born of a special bloodline to be able to do anything. And you could probably see why, after the fall of the temple in 70 AD, the Pharisees became the prominent class. Because they were already used to having some sort of a service, and in a little less organized, little less systematic way, where you had it wherever you could have it, as long as you get enough men to have it. Sometime after the destruction of the temple, the synagogues began to take on some of the features of the temple. This is interesting because it's some of what has happened in the modern synagogues today. That's why I tell you, you couldn't just study a modern synagogue to find out how the ancient synagogues worked, because they picked up some of the features of what went on in the temple because there wasn't a temple. And this is a quote. It says, "Perhaps an even greater occasion of rivalry between Christian churches and Jewish synagogues in the early part of the church was the decision that certain of the rituals of the temple could be conducted now in the synagogue." Now you could see why that caused a problem for what you'd probably refer to in that day as Messianic Jews. Jews who wanted to continue to meet at the synagogues, but they also wanted to have church with their Christian brethren. I don't see that there'd be a problem with that. You realize Paul did that very thing. As long as there wasn't some type of a difference, do you follow? In that Jewish synagogue, all they were doing was discussing the Word of God. It might even give you an opportunity to present Christ to them like Paul did so often. What caused the problem was they started to introduce some of the elements of the temple worship into the synagogue. Now, why would that be a problem for somebody that was a Christian that was going to church that wanted to go to the synagogue too? That's right. Anything that was temple related, the church believed was fulfilled by them and by Christ. So if you're going to start doing temple worship in the synagogue, now we have two completely different kinds of churches we're talking about. Before, it was really just a forum for public discussion and the law. But when you start to make the synagogue a church that's a Jewish church versus a Christian church, now there becomes a serious problem. And the rest of the quote says this: "Such a decision was made by Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, where he permitted the shofar, the ram's horn, to be blown at the Feast of the New Year in the synagogue as it had once been done in the temple." One of the many reasons the Jewish element of Christians and the Gentile element split is that the Jewish element was still trying to hold on to some of those things. Maybe they had a reason to hold on to some of them. Maybe they didn't. But they were holding on to some of those things, and the Gentile church felt like you can't hold on to those things anymore, and if you're going to continue keeping your foot in that, we're going to go our own way. And it wasn't 100 years after that there was bitter anti-Semitism in the church, probably instigated beginning with some of these very things. Well, the Jews are still worshiping in their synagogues, just as if Christ had never died. They're now starting to do some of the elements of the temple and celebrating things that are fulfilled by Christ. I want you to make the application of who the rabbis were in all this. It'll make more sense to you in studying the Gospels, especially when Jesus was discussing things with what amounted to rabbis. Rabbis were not synonymous with priests. The rabbis were really the teaching element, what amounted to, of the synagogues and of that type of an order. Rabbis were the teaching experts in the law and in the traditions of Judaism. And though they were the authority in terms of teaching, they weren't usually the overseers of the synagogue. The archisynagogus wasn't always a rabbi. So that's all I wanted to get into tonight on that. I wanted to talk to you about the synagogues because we're going to be talking in the future about the history of the church every few weeks. And I want you to know how the Jews were having church versus how the Christians began to have church. We need to figure out what was the early church order and operation of church.